Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people.
Coaches, welcome to our special 100th episode of the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast. I first off want to start and say thank you to all the incredible coaches, experts, and leaders that I've had the pleasure of interviewing for this podcast. They're incredible people who have been so generous with their most valuable resource, time. And a huge thank you to you, the listener. This podcast has always been and will always be about serving coaches. We put the time and energy into it so that it can help you grow, which we believe will help you positively impact more athletes. And that's what this is all about. So thanks for listening, sharing, engaging, and being committed to your own personal growth. We need more coaches like you in our world who are hungry to grow and to use sport for good. Wow, 100 episodes. I'm really excited to share this one with you guys. About a month ago, I was thinking through what I wanted to do for this episode, and I reached out to some former podcast guests, and I asked them to share two things with me: their number one teaching tip and their number one leadership tip. This episode is a compilation of answers from Adam Bradley of Lead 'em Up, Betsy Butterick, Coach's Coach and Communication Specialist, Alex Sarama of Basketball Immersion, Dr. Stu Singer, Sports Psychologist, Dr. Megan Bunning of FSU Coach, and Mark Bennett of PDS Coaching. I asked them these questions because this podcast journey really began for me because I saw the glaring need for coaches to grow in those two areas, teaching and leading. And I really believe that when coaches grow in those two ways, they can become the coaches that they're meant to be and also make the impact they want to make on their athletes. As always, if you enjoyed the episode and you want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. Now to our 100th episode. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, this is Adam Bradley from Lead 'em Up, and first I just want to give a shout out to Luke. Congratulations on 100 episodes. The consistency that has to take place to get there is incredibly impressive. Great job. Coaches, want to just offer up two things. One, a teaching tip for you. First, I want to encourage you to teach in a way that is learned and not heard. You see, far too often coaches are engaging in teaching, and unfortunately their players are not retaining it. You know, in fact, when you teach it and it's not retained, you simply went through the motion of teaching, but the learning was never actually experienced. It is when our players are able to retain and hold on to it is when you demonstrate the full process of teaching. So we need to teach in a way where they will learn it. Now, how do we determine that? There's a couple ways to determine that. One, I want to introduce you to a concept called active thought versus afterthought. It is so important that the things that we teach, we spend time in our leadership, the things we teach, that they live as an active thought in our players, not an afterthought. You see, active thoughts are front of mind that drive behavior. They are so front of mind because they've been instilled in us. And they oftentimes are instilled in us because we've engaged in the necessary repetition and reinforcement that has allowed this concept not just simply to be taught, but to be fully learned. And through that instilling process and that repetitive nature, it becomes firmly established in the player's mind. And when it's firmly established, it lives as an active thought, driving the behavior of our players. On the flip side, when it's not an active thought, it's an afterthought. And we all are familiar with that. Afterthoughts, you engage in behavior and then you think about after, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Well, why do you think about it after? It's because it's not front of mind enough. It's not instilled enough. It's not active, front of mind, driving the behavior. We want to teach in such a way that the things that we teach live front of mind for our players. So do not be afraid of repetitive nature of teaching. Do not be afraid of continuing to reinforce. If there's moments where you feel like, oh, we've already covered that, Well, if your players can't teach it back to you, then it still needs to be taught to them. If they can't recite the 5 components of some type of offense or some type of philosophy, if they can't remember the 5 things, then unfortunately all they did has they've heard that lesson once. They didn't learn it. Teach in a way that it is learned, that it lives as an active thought, that it is instilled in them and firmly established. Secondly, last thing, a leadership tip that I always just want to remind everybody: anything you want to see exist in your program has to be developed. It's very simple. You think about any area of sports that you want to see thrive in your programs. You want to see us thrive on defense. You want to see us thrive on offense. Well, there's an offensive coach and there's a defensive coach. You want to see our players get stronger. Well, there's a strength and conditioning coach, a trainer. Anything you want to see exist in your program has to be developed. So if you're sitting here right now and if you have any desire whatsoever to see greater leadership in your players and on your team, it needs to be developed. It needs intentional instruction and oftentimes led by someone who then could essentially be called the coach. I would love to encourage you, right? If you have a desire to build stronger leaders, have greater leadership in your program, implement a true leadership program in your program. What does a true leadership program look like? We say it is when you commit to 12 sessions, 12 uninterrupted, distraction-free moments of learning within your team during a calendar year. That is you representing and exemplifying a true leadership program in your program. It doesn't mean you talk about it pre-practice and occasionally have a guest speaker and occasionally work with the leadership council, but not the rest of the team. No, it's a holistic, team-wide commitment of 12 sessions during a calendar year. When you do that, you will begin to see the momentum of your leadership in your team be transformed. Anything you want to see exist in your program has to be developed. Development comes from a plan and intentional practice. Would love for you to encourage and lean into that. Hey, I'm Adam. Lead 'em up. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Betsy Butterick, the coach's coach and communications specialist. And my number one teaching tip for coaches would be using what's commonly known as the Socratic method or motivational interviewing. And the reason that this is so crucial, why it's my top tip, especially for those of us that are now coaching Gen Z student athletes, is when we involve our players in the learning process, we deepen the learning experience and it makes for stickier learning. So I know across sport, it is always more expedient to tell than to ask. And yet when I look across sport at the highest performing programs at any level, what I notice consistently about their coaches is the coaches are very intentional about involving their student athletes in the learning process. For example, very common practice for a coach to explain a drill and then to say something like, okay, everybody got it? Which isn't truly a question. What we're asking for in that statement, everybody got it, is more for affirmation than for information about what they didn't understand. So the first step is asking, what questions do you have? Which is different than asking, are there any questions? Let's say nobody has questions in that space. Before jumping into the drill, which is the logical next step for most coaches, I would layer onto that, okay, quick review. Before we get started, how many lines do we need? Where are the balls going to start? What's the first pass that we're going to make? And I'm coming from a basketball background, but taking a moment to re-emphasize the points that you just made about how you want the drill to operate before actually going to start the drill. So they're filling in the bits and pieces of information that they've just heard. They're repeating it back to you. And it adds a second opportunity for those who may have tuned out a little bit during your explanation to catch back on and tune in before we're asking the team to execute as a whole. Another place where there's great opportunities to involve our student athletes in the learning process is when we finish a drill. So when we finish a drill, again, common practice for coaching staff to blow the whistle and then say what they observed. Completely different experience for our student athletes if instead we blow the whistle and then we give them even 2 minutes. Okay, huddle up with your team. Your 3 questions are what worked, what didn't work, and now what? If we were going to run the drill back, what would you want to do differently this next time around? The reason that this becomes so important, not just that day, but in the future, is across sport, these are the types of conversations that ideally we want our team having during competition. And I think about sports like soccer where there's no timeout. So if I can get my players in the habit of having these types of conversations while they're on the field, if I can increase their comfort level with each other to dialogue around these topics, they're better suited to succeed during moments of competition. Same thing, even if we're maybe in transition halftime of our sport to a locker room, or depending on your sport, if you're in between, sets or races or competitions, being able to be comfortable having these kinds of conversations about tactics and strategy is an ideal space for our student athletes to be in. We can help set them up for that success by allowing them not only to practice their skills in our training sessions, but practice their communication skills as well. So my number one teaching tip for coaches is to get comfortable asking questions. And where I see this be challenging for some coaches is if historically the questions that coaches have asked have come in the form of rhetorical questions. Classic example would be, let's say, I know my team isn't executing with the energy and enthusiasm that they are capable of. And so at some point in practice, I yell out, "Is that as hard as we can go?" And I'm not truly expecting an answer. I know they can go harder. They know they can go harder. The problem with asking rhetorical questions, or any question with which we don't truly expect an answer, is we're conditioning our team over time to not have to respond. And then let's say we're in a team huddle and we ask a question as a coaching staff that we truly want an answer to, and we get nothing but silence and blank stares. So this is why it's important. Any question that you want answered, be intentional about only asking those types of questions. And then as coaches, we need to practice the ability to wait. And it's been a case where now in my work as a facilitator, sometimes I'll be working with a team and maybe it's the first time that we're sharing a space together. And I'll ask a question into the room and then I'll wait. And nobody says anything. And I'll tell them, I've had years to practice being very comfortable waiting. So, I'm quite comfortable waiting as long as it takes to source the information that can only come from you all. The other thing to think about, and this is not always, I'll say, doable depending on the space that we're in, but giving people different tools with which to respond. So instead of asking for them to contribute their voice in front of their peers, and we know that the fear of peer judgment is a big challenge for members of Gen Z specifically. So as opposed to previous generations, they may be less likely, I'll say, to add their voice in front of their peers for fear of what their peers are going to think about what they say. Doing a pair and share is an easy, quick way to get information flowing through your team before asking individuals to share to the group as a whole. So you can ask a question to your team and say, turn to the person next to you, and you're going to get 30 seconds to discuss your thoughts, and then we'll come back and see what came up for the group. When you do that pair and share first, it's like a mini warm-up. And now we're talking with just one person, a teammate. For most people, that's very comfortable. And then when we ask for information from the group, those individuals that are naturally more comfortable are now more likely to share information that we might not have gotten before because they've talked with someone and gotten multiple perspectives or points of view. So a few teaching tips there. The number one leadership tip that I have is what I'll frame as a missed opportunity. Oftentimes as leaders, when coaches are leaders of their program, whether assistant coach, head coach, volunteer, at any level, high school, college, professional, we feel often that it's our responsibility to know or to fix, or we're constantly scanning for, okay, that didn't work. What needs to shift or change in order to be better moving forward? What we miss in those moments of trying to find the answer or create the solution or remedy the issue is we miss opportunities to be in it with our athletes. And what I mean by being in it with them is, can we occupy that space of hardship or that space of challenge without moving to fix it or change it? Maybe we have an answer, or maybe we have a fix. Before we go there, can we validate where an individual or a team finds itself? Even saying, this is really hard, or I didn't expect us to be here. Modeling that vulnerability without blame, being able to validate without judgment wherever that individual or the team finds themselves, those are hugely connective moments for coaches. And yet often, because of what we are tasked to do, we skip over those moments and get directly into what needs to shift or change. And it's just, it really is truly a missed opportunity. There's nothing inherently wrong with skipping that space and going right into what's needed or what's next. But when I see coaches pause and take a moment to join the individual or the team in that space of hardship or challenge, what I see more often is a more connected team and a more cohesive culture. And so that's why, as leaders, my number one leadership tip is look for opportunities of challenge, of failure. And then can you be with an athlete or with your team in that space? You don't have to stay there long, but can you acknowledge it? Can you validate it? Can you join them there before you ask them to move forward?
This is Alex Sarama from Basketball Immersion and College Prep Italy. My number one advice for coaches would be to have a theoretical framework and an understanding for why and how you coach. This for me is where the constraints-led approach underpinned by ecological dynamics is critical. If we don't have a unified framework for how we view the game and how we coach, it means that really all we're relying on is assumption, personal experiences, all the latest trends and fads within our sport. By using an evidence-informed approach, we can avoid that and really make sure that there's a very strong underpinning and a link to the evidence for why we approach certain things and, essentially explaining why we coach a certain way. For me, the constraints-led approach is now fast becoming a contemporary coaching methodology used by coaches in all sports. And I think it's essential for any coach working in the modern game at any level to understand what it is and how they can use it to properly, develop and help their athletes. So for me, I think a lot of resources out there. There's new things shared every week on Twitter and various websites. But I think getting to grips with what the constraints-led approach is key. And it's essentially the idea that, skills are an emergent property. So skills are not techniques or things that players own. They emerge as a result of interacting constraints. And these constraints are ever present in any game or any practice. Individual task, environmental constraints are constantly interacting to lead to the movement solutions and the skills that we see. So very important. I mean, when we look at constraints, individual constraints could be things related to the player, such as their height, wingspan, weight, perceptual abilities. Then we've got the task constraints, which are relevant to our sport, the rules of the game, the aim of a particular activity in practice, the number of opponents, scoring systems. And then we have environmental constraints, which are physical or socio-cultural properties, things like the lighting, heating, surface, etc. But the idea is when we understand that these constraints are constantly interacting, and as coaches, we can purposefully manipulate them in a practice setting to lead to new skills emerging. Now, second part of this, and looking at the ecological dynamics part, is the fact that perception and action coupling is constantly occurring, and players in any sport, they will perceive to act and they will act to perceive. So the biggest problem we have is how in many sports, the perception part has really been neglected in the training environment and this is seen where players solely kind of focus on the action part, looking at techniques, teaching moves, etc. But instead, the problem with that is we're removing all the specifying information, aka the information that players need to make decisions, such as teammates, defenders, the score, and we're taking that out of the training environment, and therefore, we're working on things in practice that really aren't helping players become more skillful. So the whole idea with perception and action coupling is, keep them coupled, as Rob Gray says. Can we create those situations in practice where players are in small-sided games and getting used to acting on the relevant affordances, which are opportunities for action? So for instance, in a pick and roll, possible affordances could be for a player to reject, to use the pick and pass to the roller, to make a skip pass, to dribble around the defense and get downhill. So it's very important that the same affordances that players face in their real environment, aka a game, can be recreated in practice. And that's where we come back to the constraint-led approach, we can really amplify these affordances. So for instance, what I just mentioned in regard to the pick and roll, we could create a 2-on-2 which directs players towards acting or not acting on some of these invitations to action. So it's very different to a games approach where, we play some small-sided games, but maybe the manipulation of constraints is not so kind of specific and players kind of do the same games each time. With the constraint-led approach, it goes one step further as we are really purposefully manipulating constraints and respecting the environment-athlete relationship, which is key, because when we view skill is the relationship between the player and their environment. So my number one advice to coaches is, by having this framework for how you view the game, your sport, it really is a huge mindset shift, because you will approach your sport and your practices in a completely different way. And when you have an understanding of this, other models such as information processing, or talking about things like cognitive load, you just won't need, and then it will really change the way you approach player dev, team practices, coaching the game, film sessions, because everything links back to this framework. So I hope this helps. Obviously, for more information, Luke has some great resources through Cutting Edge, and of course, check out Twitter. My Twitter is Alex J. Sarama, and website is basketballimmersion.com. This is Alex Sarama again, coming in with my top advice on leadership and culture for coaches in all sports. I think how you coach firstly sets the tone for the type of environment and culture you have in your program. I previously referenced the constraints-led approach in terms of my number one advice to coaches. And again, if you coach in this way and you create that environment where it's safe for players to make mistakes, and it's very clear that this is an environment where the needs of the player and their learning come first, I think naturally that shapes the tone for having a great culture. If you're using a traditional approach in terms of drills and trying to limit mistakes and things like that, it's very difficult to have a culture whereby players feel safe and feel like they can make mistakes and learn. So I think, again, it all starts with that. And, if you're trying to address your team's culture, I think actually looking at how you coach and how you're running your practices, it would be the first place to start. Then, coming in, once we've got that, I think we do a number of things off the court. And the key thing is it's authentic, and it feels like the stuff we're doing is who we are as people. It's not fake. It's not artificial. I see a lot of culture things in the basketball world, like things like reading books together. And to be honest, I just find some of that with players a little bit cringy. Like we're working with 16 to 19-year-old boys, and a lot of coaches, I'm sure listening to this will be college coaches or working with players of a similar age. And it's like, ultimately, when we're doing like team activities or anything related to our culture, I don't want the guys to feel like, oh, this is weird. So a lot of the things we do naturally are just very authentic. So for instance, we have a team meeting every week with our players, and this team meeting will often cover a number of different topics, from life skills to whatever. And last week we had one where we've got players from all different countries, just presented on where they're from and what their environment is, their culture. And we wanted to foster a sense of belonging, and some really good work on this coming from Owen Eastwood and his book Belonging, in terms of how can you create that feeling and create belonging cues within your program. And again, I like it because there's actually a good evidence base for this stuff. It's not just kind of your random quotes or generic things about culture. So I think things like that, where the players are involved and they have autonomy, are key. And then for us, a key thing is we have 4 program values. So values are it's not just applied to how we practice or what the team does. It's these values extend to everything. So the players live together in dormitories. So the whole idea is that we can also tie these values into their living situation and talk about that. So they're essentially behaviors, and we actually had the players chose 2 and the coaches chose 2. So we spoke about them at the at the start of the season, and it's great because we can reference back to them at any point in season during practices, and they also provide a really good framework for debriefs. So at the end of practice, I might just stop, when we're finishing, I might link back to one of our values and say, who really provided a great example of living up to our value of creativity today. So, we've got 4 values. It's growth, creativity, joy, fight. But the whole idea is that players had a chance to kind of be involved in choosing those, and they're really relevant, to the group we have. Then just culture-wise, I think the practice environment is one of the most important things in culture, because it's probably where you spend the most amount of time with your group. So naturally, I think if you create a fun environment and an environment where, as coaches, we know that we have such an impact on our players, given the age, like we're not that much older than them. And, I think we know that they see us as really positive role models. So we're very conscious of the fact that, our behaviors need to inspire them and give them an idea as to, when they grow up, give them an idea as to what transformational kind of leadership looks like. And, that means in practices, we're not going to be yellers, screamers. We're definitely not going to be doing that in games. We're going to be rational. We're going to treat them, in ways that if we were playing and we were in their situation, we would want to be treated that way. And I think, to me, that's the most important thing with culture. I see a lot of coaches talking about culture, doing things off the court, but then I watch them in a practice session and they're screaming, yelling, and their behavior kind of undoes all the other work they're doing. So my number one takeaway would just be very aware and self-aware of kind of how you are in a practice, how you're interacting with your players. And I think a positive practice environment can be the best thing for culture in a program.
Now, answers from Dr. Stu Singer.
From my perspective as a sport and performance psychologist, the best advice that I can give any coach is to really dive in to working on your own mental game. A coach should absolutely have their own coach. Coaching is more difficult and stressful than it's ever been. There are a variety of reasons for this, with most of them being beyond our control. So the best thing we can do is work with someone that can give us some healthy and effective skills that tend to our own stresses and pressures, anxieties, motivation, our own work-life balance, recovery, our values, self-awareness, challenges, or whatever else that you may need. If you do this, you can show up each day as the best version of yourself that you can be that day. And then potentially the best byproduct of doing this is that you'll end up understanding your players so much better, because you'll have a new lens that you're viewing all of this with, and you may just know how to help them better as well. For me, in my role as a sport and performance psychologist, the most important thing that all leaders can learn about and then attempt to build is trust. We can get consumed by what our resume is, or what title we hold, or X's and O's. But until trusting, authentic, caring relationships are built, the rest of it really doesn't matter. There's a quote that they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And the reality is, this is very true. Coaching is all about helping people move towards what takes them beyond their current comfort zone. And in order to do this and help them grow and expand what they're capable of, they first have to trust. Without first establishing authentic trust, we can basically be assured that we're not truly getting everything possible from them. They're going to hold back at least a bit. Ask yourself, do my players feel and understand that I want what's best for them? Do they see me as competent? Am I consistent with them each day? Do they know what they're getting? Is my agenda about them, or can I get focused on what this all means for me and my career? Maybe you can get some feedback on these from a trusted assistant coach, one that'll be honest with you. However, if these are each in place, I can guarantee you that you're on track with building a really solid trusting environment.
Hey Luke, this is Dr. Megan Bunning with FSU Coach Interdisciplinary Center. So you asked us to give you responses to 2 questions. And so I'll answer the first question, which is the single piece of teaching advice for coaches that I could give. And so being a now higher education educator and former coach, what I can say is that my advice would be for coaches is to make sure that when you are delivering information that you want your athletes or even staff to know and to understand, is to make sure that you're teaching and delivering that information in a way that they prefer to learn versus what you prefer to learn. So for example, if you grew up reading text and a bunch of books and that's the way that you prefer to learn, you may unknowingly be presenting information to those that are trying to learn from you through a lot of text. Well, they may not learn information or enjoy that way of learning as much as you do, and you don't even know it. You're just presenting information. We do this all the time where we present ways that are comfortable for us and not realizing that whoever we're presenting to, that's not really comfortable for them or their preferred way of learning. So taking the time to get to know your athletes or whomever you are trying to instruct and making sure that you're delivering content in ways that they enjoy, in the way that they can understand versus yourself. Your next question is about leadership. The single best piece of leadership advice that I could give for coaches is to be intentional in making sure that you are using not only your staff, but your athletes to their strengths and their capabilities. So for instance, if you have an assistant coach on staff who excels in engaging with the community or fundraising or team building, and it really can be anything, I'm just using those as an example, but that's their strength. When they get in front of a crowd, they light up, or when they engage with the community, it's genuine and authentic, then allow them to be that face in front of the community for that purpose. If it's fundraising, if it's community events, allow them maybe to take some leadership responsibility in that area of what you want to do with your team. The point is that if you have staff and you have athletes where you are acknowledging that this is their strength and they're good at it, and I'm going to make sure I am utilizing their strength, not only for their growth, but for the team as a whole as well. It's a win-win situation. But it goes a long way in helping those individuals see that they're seen, they're validated, and you respect and you admire the strengths that they bring to the table versus knowing that they have a strength, or maybe not even knowing, and not utilizing that strength. They're going to feel underutilized. They're going to feel like eventually that they're being disrespected maybe. So just as a leader, making sure that you are maximizing everybody's potential and strengths that they bring and how that they can help that team as a whole. Thank you for including me on the podcast and in your many adventures, and it's been fun to watch you grow.
A quick disclaimer about this audio from Mark Bennett. It's a little bit shaky, but the content is so good that I still wanted to include it. Stick with it. You're going to like what he shares.
Hi, this is Mark Bennett from pdscoach.com. Top tip for coaches is use what I call player first, player last. And what this basically means is when you're in interactions with any athletes, and indeed coach, let's look at athletes, we've got to make sure that what's being said is really connecting with their understanding, and their dialogue needs to be of a higher proportion than ours if we're about developing them to think for themselves, if they're the person going to act on what the discussion is in the agreement. So player first, player last simply means when you call a player over, we ask them to review first whatever is an experience they've had, or their understanding of something that you're agreeing is going to be a successful focus. So let's imagine now they're coming off the pitch of a court and you've just called them off the pitch court and you're just going, can you just review what happened over there? What we're looking for is their awareness of what they saw, what options there were, and them just qualifying and quantifying why they committed to the choice that they took, and indeed, did they commit, and if they change anything. So when we're having that, actually what we're doing is we're listening a lot more without thinking, I'm looking for an answer. We're actually listening with intent. Then we have the dialogue if you need any clarification. It may be, so what if this happens, etc. The player last is really critical. So whatever's been agreed, we always finish with, and there can be some key lines for this, I'll share a few with you. Either, so what have we agreed? And then you just listen. And then it's the players going last saying, okay, we've agreed, I'm going to do this. Or it may be, so what are you going to commit to? So after the conversation, that's the question you ask. And then they say, I'm going to commit to this. And you're just listening to make sure what's been agreed is actually what that person's saying. And then it's just a fist punch, great, show me, off they go. Then obviously what you're looking for is, are they committing to what they've agreed? Now, the beauty of that player last is what can often happen in many situations is you're having a conversation as an agreement and you think, that's it, we've nailed it. But actually, they're a bit lost. So they want to please coach and they're sort of nodding and agreeing, or the conversation may have been a bit too long. Now they've lost what the critical point is in the agreement. By doing that player last and then listening, you'll find out if that's the case or not. I guarantee you, and this is just over my experience, when you first start doing the player last, you'll identify that actually they don't really understand what was said and they're not sure what you've agreed. Now that is important because then you can dial down, keep it simplistic, deal with the issue, seek the clarity, and then we do the player last. And then they go, okay, so I'm going to commit to this, or we've agreed this. And that's great, show me. So really good tool to make sure, hang on a minute, what's being said, is it going in and do they understand what they're going to do? And then we're scanning for, are they committing to it? Not if it's coming off or not. We're not looking at the outcome. We're looking for, are they committing to what they agreed? So that is what I call player first, player last. Top tip for developing leadership and to be a great leader is ensure you know what your lighthouse is and everybody involved understands what it looks like and feels like to them and the value in achieving there. So the lighthouse is, what is that process you're working towards? What does that look like? What does it sound and feel like? What is it we're building towards? The reference. And it has to be contextually for the people that are involved in that journey. So the value is they may not need to like it, but they really need to see the value in why we need to get there. The picture of detail in what's it mean to them, how's it connect is really important. Once everyone understands that, then it's what we need to do is make sure when we're making decisions, we're always referencing back to the pre-agreed lighthouse. So how does that fit with who we want to become, who we want to be, where we need to get to? And that will allow a reference point in all discussions, all decisions to ensure that, hang on, why are we doing this? Well, actually, that doesn't align to a lighthouse. Let's get rid of it, even if we've been doing it for decades. So agreeing your lighthouse, making it really clear, continuing to reference it, making sure everyone involved, from the janitor all the way through to the most senior managers, irrelevant who it is, they understand what it looks like, the value, what it means to them, and how they're going to impact that. That's the point of the importance of what they're going to bring to the table in daily behaviors, choices, commitment, that's going to allow us to get closer to that lighthouse. So the lighthouse point of reference is a fantastic leadership tool that actually should be one of the first elements you always do when you're starting out on a journey for yourself, especially when you want to lead others or influence them to be able to self-manage themselves within the same direction, which could be in different departments, could be in different clubs aligned to the same business. So that is the lighthouse.
Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and a huge thank you to all the guests from today's show. You can find links to connect with each of them in the show details. And if you found this episode valuable, or you find the podcast in general valuable, would you take 30 seconds to share it with a coaching friend? It goes a long way towards helping us reach more coaches who can then impact more athletes. Thanks for listening to the podcast. We'll see you next week.